The damp chill of an October evening clung to Oxford with the sort of persistence one hardly notices until it has settled into the bones. I walked along the high street, the cobblestones glistening under the waning light, as though the city itself had been polished for some private observance. Gas lamps flickered uncertainly against the mist rising from the Thames, and the spires of the colleges loomed like watchful sentinels, their shadows merging with the early darkness. Students passed in small, hurried clusters, their laughter carrying with it a youthful carelessness that seemed almost indecent in contrast to the solemnity of ancient stone. I had begun my evening with no particular intent, save to stretch my legs and allow my thoughts to wander, but even aimless walks through Oxford invariably stir reflection. At a narrow alleyway near St. Mary's, I paused to observe a street lamp trembling under the weight of rain. A line of verse from a long-forgotten Keats poem drifted unbidden through my mind. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Odd how certain lines take on new significance in the cold, when streets are empty and the mind insists upon its own company. The air carried the faint scent of burning leaves and distant smoke from kitchen chimneys, mingling with the sharper tang of wet stone. In a shop window, a stack of leather-bound volumes caught my eye, and I lingered to read the spines, each name a promise of knowledge, argument, and subtle human folly. One particularly thin volume of poetry, misattributed according to the bookseller, contained a phrase that pricked at my memory, the heart's secret concealed in shadow. I did not purchase the book, yet the words lingered, weaving themselves quietly into the fabric of the evening. A church bell tolled somewhere beyond the rooftops, its sonorous voice threading through the mist. I noted the rhythm, measured and deliberate, and allowed myself a small smile at the absurdity of my own attention to such things. To most, it was merely a timekeeper. To me, it marked the cadence of anticipation, the subtle turning of events that would only later reveal themselves as significant. My steps carried me further, past the quadrangle of a college where autumn leaves had gathered in drifts along the stone balustrades. The windows glowed faintly, offering glimpses of private study and whispered conversation. A porter shuffled across the courtyard, pausing to look at the sky as though he too were aware of the delicate darkness that had fallen upon the city. I made a mental note of the angle of his lantern, the way it fell upon the wet cobbles, reflecting in pools of water. Minor details, perhaps, yet in Oxford they often presage far more than the immediate eye can perceive. There was a brief incident, scarcely more than a shadow, that caught my attention. A young woman dropping a folded sheet of paper near the college gate, retrieving it with a nervous glance over her shoulder. The paper, unremarkable in form, might have been of consequence, though I did not pursue it. I merely filed the image away, folded corners, hesitant fingers, trusting that someday the significance of such minutiae would emerge, as they inevitably do. As I turned toward the river, the water dark and reflective, I felt the peculiar ache that Oxford often inspires in me. The mixture of beauty, melancholy, and the unspoken sense that beneath every spire, every lantern, lies a shadow waiting patiently for recognition. The evening, though quiet, hummed with latent stories, and for some reason I could not yet name, my mind kept returning to the misquoted line in the window display, to the trembling street lamp, and to the folded paper in the gutter. There was an autumn hush in the city, an anticipation that one cannot measure by clocks or calendars. Somewhere beyond the mist, something was waiting to unsettle that hush, to turn ordinary shadows into questions that demanded answers. And I, as ever, was already walking toward them. It was some hours later, after a brief dinner of solitary fish and lukewarm tea, that I discovered the note. I remember it as distinctly out of place, a slip of cream paper folded with care, its edges neat, its message brief yet insistent. All is not as it seems at Linton College. Beware the masked host. I read it twice, aloud to the empty room, feeling the words settle over me like the mist along the Isis. There was no signature, no indication of intent beyond the caution, and yet the phrasing carried a rhythm that suggested a cultivated hand. The preposition felt deliberate, the capitalization exact. It was not the hasty scrawl of a nervous student. I reflected on the choice of words, the minor anomaly in syntax, while Lewis, ever pragmatic, would have dismissed it as eccentricity. I felt otherwise. There was an unspoken warning in that diction, the quiet insistence that appearances, especially on Halloween, could be treacherous. In the shadows of Oxford, treachery often wears an academic mask, and I have long learned to read between the lines that most overlook. By the time I arrived at Linton College, night had settled fully. Lanterns swung in the quadrangle, their light wavering upon the stone walls, and the air smelled of damp leaves and candle wax. The college gates were closed, though a few undergraduates lingered, some in costume, others in the careless abandon of youth. A porter's nod was sufficient to gain entrance. His eyes, shadowed beneath a worn cap, hinted at an unasked question, a recognition of the night's peculiarity. The party itself was scattered now, its earlier gaiety replaced by whispers and speculation. I noted the arrangement of chairs and tables, the tilted wine glasses abandoned mid-sip, and a faint scuff upon the polished floorboards where someone must have stumbled in haste. These were minor details, yet each has its own narrative. There was no immediate sign of violence, only the residue of tension, as if the evening had conspired to reveal secrets only to those who could discern them. The victim had been found in the library an hour prior, according to the caretaker, slumped over a pile of manuscripts. No apparent struggle, no overt injury, merely the unnatural stillness of a man removed from the flow of life. Yet the eyes of those who saw him first spoke of something amiss. A glance at the ceiling, the trembling of hands, the catch of a breath too long held. I allowed myself a brief survey, noting the victim's last gestures, the alignment of papers upon his desk, and a faint indentation upon the blotter, as though the weight of an unseen hand had pressed insistently. I lingered there, alone with the shadows and the candlelight, and began a mental inventory of the attendees. There was the young poet whose verse often veered toward melancholia, the visiting scholar with a fondness for riddles and wordplay, and the college librarian who watched all with an almost imperceptible amusement. Each carried a private tension, an undercurrent of rivalry or concealed affection, and yet none had betrayed it openly. It is in such silences, more than in declarations, that character is revealed. I allowed the note to remain in my breast pocket, a constant, silent companion as I questioned the few remaining guests. One student, nervous yet precise, mentioned an argument by the fireplace before the victim retired for the evening. Another recalled the masked host moving among the tables with deliberate attention, a presence both watchful and unremarkable, the kind that leaves no memory save for a sense of being observed. I registered each statement without comment, arranging them in the quiet, deliberate cataloguing that has always been my method. As I departed, the wind rattled the windows and carried with it a faint echo of laughter from the party, distant, distorted, like a memory played backward. I felt the night fold around the college, the notes warning a persistent pulse at my side. Some part of me, the part that reads the unspoken, suspected that this would not remain an academic curiosity for long. The masquerade, the anonymous caution, and the subtleties of gesture and phrase were threads already converging into a pattern I had yet to fully perceive. The morning after the note, I returned to Linton College with the sense that the night's shadows had not fully relinquished their hold. The masquerade was over, yet its echoes lingered in scattered masks, half-drunk glasses, and the faint tang of spilt wine that clung to the polished wood of the hall. I walked among the tables, letting my eyes linger on the angles of chairs and the alignment of discarded paper. Each object, in its unassuming way, held the potential to speak if one possessed the patience to listen. Photographs of the party had been delivered to the college secretary, printed in haste by a student eager to preserve memory, or perhaps conceal it. I examined them quietly, noting the slight tilt of a table, the deliberate spacing between certain guests, and the one mask that appeared more than once, always partially obscuring the wearer's face. There was an elegance to the costume, the careful draping of fabric, the subtle curve of a hand resting upon a balustrade. Most would pass it over, but I found in repetition the quiet insistence of intent. I overheard fragments of conversation as I moved. One student remarking that the victim had been unusually insistent about leaving early, another mentioning a fleeting dispute near the fireplace. I did not interject. Observation, I found, is more revealing than interrogation when emotion is taught and masked by propriety. Lewis, meanwhile, pressed a junior scholar on the whereabouts of certain guests, his voice carrying a note of brisk impatience that I found mildly disconcerting. The student's eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of amusement, as though he knew more than he let on. Among the papers scattered across a side table, I noticed an invitation, partially torn, bearing a line of verse misquoted from Shelley. It was minor, almost laughable, yet the misquotation struck me with subtle significance. One does not misquote Shelley without a sense of carelessness, or perhaps a desire to misdirect. The alignment of the verse, in relation to a spilled glass of wine nearby, suggested a small drama unnoticed by others. A moment of agitation, a gesture of secrecy or frustration preserved in still life. The librarian approached at a measured pace, her expression neutral, yet attentive. She commented on the disruption, the disorder left behind by what she termed youthful enthusiasm, and I registered the inflection of her voice. There was a quiet amusement there, a slight hesitation before her words, which hinted that she had perceived more than she admitted. The tilt of her head, the brief lift of her eyebrow, were gestures I catalogued silently. Nothing is ever without meaning, and Oxford teaches one to read in shadows as much as in text. I turned to the windows, observing the light filtering across the quadrangle. Damp leaves clung to the stone steps, moved now and then by the wind, as if the courtyard itself were conspiring to reveal secrets. One detail struck me. A footprint, faint in the morning dew upon the flagstones, leading from the hall to the library. It was small, careful, deliberate. The shoes of a student, perhaps, though not one I had yet accounted for among the witnesses. Minor, almost inconsequential. Yet it suggested a path unspoken, a motion unnoticed by the more casual eye. There was a peculiar resonance to the masks themselves. Each conceals and reveals in equal measure. The gesture of lifting one at the wrong moment, or the angle at which it rests upon the face, can betray intent. I recalled the repetition in the photographs, the same costume in multiple frames, and allowed the implication to unfold quietly. Who wore it, when, and why did the pattern repeat? That question, lodged in the back of my mind, began to thread through the various anecdotes, gestures, and misplaced objects I had catalogued. The moment passed with the quiet inevitability of an autumn dusk. I left the hall, the smell of candle wax lingering on my coat, the weight of observation pressing gently upon my shoulders. Something had shifted, imperceptibly in the arrangement of detail. A fragment of a photograph, a misquoted line, a faint footprint, all converging to suggest a clue that would only reveal its significance later, when patience and attention had done their work. The masquerade, it seemed, had left more than laughter in its wake. It had left a question, and that question was already pressing at the edges of understanding. I returned to Linton College later that afternoon, the streets sodden and gleaming beneath a low autumn sun. The wind had shifted, carrying the chill of the river and the faint tang of smoke from distant chimneys, and with it the quiet sense that the city held its breath, waiting. I found the quadrangle empty, save for a few students scurrying to tutorials, their voices clipped and cautious, as though aware of eyes that lingered upon them. There is always a residual hush after disruption, a subtle wariness in manner and gait, and I noticed it immediately. The caretaker's report, given in halting speech over a thermos of tea, spoke of arguments that had simmered long before the masquerade. Academic rivalry, bruised pride, and the unacknowledged ambitions of colleagues who had long envied the victim's position. I observed the subtle tension in his hands as he poured tea, noting the slight tremor that accompanied mention of the victim's name. Anxiety rarely announces itself so openly, and yet in these measured hesitations one often glimpses more truth than in impassioned protest. Among the scattered belongings in the library, I discovered a diary page half hidden beneath a pile of papers, its edges frayed and corners smudged with candle soot. A brief notation referred to a secret liaison, an old acquaintance whose name was replaced by a cryptic initial. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, yet the undercurrent of emotion could not be disguised, a mix of regret, fear, and a sense of impending consequence. I traced the inked letters with a fingertip, noting a pressure variation in the script that suggested hesitation, a pause in thought captured in graphite. I later spoke with a young poet who had been present at the masquerade. Her recollections were precise yet emotionally restrained, a measured recounting of conversations overheard by the fireplace, of glances exchanged across the room. She mentioned a visiting academic whose demeanor had struck her as peculiar, attentive, yet avoiding direct engagement. The subtlety of his gestures, the occasional pause before responding, gave me the impression of calculated restraint. Minor as these observations seemed, they began to weave a network of behavior that would prove significant. A brief survey of the college gardens revealed traces of movement along the damp paths, footprints that led toward the riverbank, vanishing before the wrought iron gates, and a single trampled flower, crushed beneath a hurried step. The placement suggested not randomness, but intent, a path chosen carefully to avoid notice. I catalogued these silent marks, filing them alongside the diary, the photographs, and the whispered accounts from students and staff. Each fragment of detail, small in isolation, began to resonate with the quiet logic of a pattern yet unformed. There was an interaction in particular that lingered in my memory. The librarian, who approached under the guise of casual observation, pausing at the threshold of the reading room. Her gaze rested briefly on a shelf, then shifted to me, and for an instant the angle of her head and the lift of a single eyebrow conveyed more than any words could. I registered it silently, noting that the unspoken, the gesture unnoticed by most, often reveals the undercurrent of motive. By evening, I had constructed a tentative map of the college's whispered secrets, rivalries, concealed romances, minor grievances magnified by pride and circumstance. Each thread carried a weight of human emotion, and I felt the familiar melancholy of recognition. The city, the colleges, the people within them, all dancing upon the edge of revelation and concealment. Oxford, in its quiet and measured way, keeps its secrets with care, yet those willing to observe may, in the smallest details, glimpse the fissures beneath the polished stone. I departed as the shadows lengthened, the scent of rain-soaked leaves and ink lingering in the air. The evening promised a clarity of thought that daylight obscures, and I suspected that in these whispered secrets some small clue, as yet overlooked, would reveal itself in due time. I had learned long ago to wait for such moments. Oxford's patience is exacting, but invariably rewarding. By mid-morning, the air over Oxford had settled into a brittle clarity, the rain having fled, leaving streets that glistened and reflected the spires like polished mirrors. I wandered once more through Linton College, letting my gaze settle on the aftermath of the masquerade. Overturned chairs, ribbons caught on door handles, and the faint, lingering scent of wine and candle smoke. Such residual traces rarely lie, yet they often mislead, deliberately or otherwise. Today, it seemed, I was confronted with precisely that. False paths that promised resolution but concealed their irrelevance beneath a veneer of plausibility. Two theories had begun to circulate among staff and students, each with a logic that invited credence. One implicated a student whose jealousy of the victim's recognition in academic circles seemed plausible. The other pointed to a colleague whose resentment had simmered quietly for years, masked beneath courteous conversation and mild, sardonic humor. Both, I thought, were attractive to the mind's desire for neat causality, yet neither fully satisfied. There was a subtle dissonance in each narrative, a gesture unaccounted for, a pause in speech that hinted at incompleteness. I paused at the library doorway, observing the meticulous alignment of manuscripts on the central desk. A brief misquote in one of the victim's letters caught my attention. A line from Byron rendered incorrectly, the misplaced adverb suggesting either inattentiveness or deliberate disguise. The nuance of misquotation is often underestimated, yet it can betray the author's intent as readily as a confession. I considered the possibility that the misquote, though minor, was meant to steer perception, to mislead an observer inclined towards surface logic. Lewis, meanwhile, approached with a briskness that contrasted sharply with my own methodical pacing. He pressed a student for clarification on movements within the hall, noting the presence of the masked host and the times at which certain individuals arrived. The student answered with careful precision, yet a tremor in his voice suggested he knew more than he admitted. I allowed Lewis to conduct his questioning while I observed the small gestures, the tapping of a foot, the subtle tilting of a head, the slight frown when a particular name was mentioned. These were details easily dismissed, yet in my experience they carry the weight of truth. The photographs from the evening continued to reveal minor discrepancies. In one, a mask appears twice, worn by different figures, its placement slightly altered. Such repetition could be attributed to chance, yet the alignment of gestures and proximity to the victim suggested deliberation. I traced the lines of sight in each frame, noting who was facing whom, the inclination of a shoulder, the angle of a hand resting upon a chair. The subtle choreography hinted at narrative, though its meaning remained obscured. At a quiet moment, I revisited the misquoted line in the Byron letter, reading it aloud to myself. The error was not random. The alteration of syntax shifted the emphasis, obscuring motive while highlighting a secondary, less obvious concern. Reputation. Someone, I suspected, had intentionally directed attention away from themselves, allowing suspicion to settle comfortably on another. The beauty of a red herring is its ability to soothe the mind while concealing the truth, and Oxford provides fertile ground for such elegant misdirection. By afternoon, I felt the tension of observation and deduction coalescing into a private rhythm. I catalogued the false leads, the misquoted lines, the gestures overlooked by casual inspection. Each item, small in isolation, was beginning to illuminate the periphery of the real pattern, though the center remained hidden. It is in the patient collection of such fragments, the quiet attention to gesture and phrasing, that the mind begins to sense the trajectory of events before they are fully revealed. I left the library with the faint odor of candle wax clinging to my coat, the sunlight catching damp leaves along the quadrangle. The masquerade had left its traces, some truthful, some deliberately misleading, and I understood, once more, that the path to clarity in Oxford is rarely direct. One must walk among shadows, attending to the faintest irregularity, knowing that red herrings are not merely distractions, but lessons in subtlety and misdirection, and that patience will ultimately coax the truth into quiet undeniable presence. The library at Linton College possesses an atmosphere that is at once comforting and oppressive, as though the accumulation of centuries of thought presses against the walls and settles into the air. I entered mid-afternoon, when sunlight slanted through the tall windows, catching dust motes like tiny constellations suspended in amber. The scent of old paper and waxed oak was pervasive, and I allowed myself a long, deliberate inhalation, knowing that the physicality of books often illuminates truths that mere conversation cannot. Lewis had already begun cataloguing the correspondence related to the victim. I followed a quieter path, observing the placement of letters, the uneven stacks of paper, and the careful way a scholar's hand rests upon inked parchment. One folder, misfiled and partially burned at the edges, drew my attention. Its contents were fragmentary: postmarked envelopes, abbreviated phrases, veiled allusions, yet within them a thread of tension that suggested long-standing grievance. I traced the ink with my fingertip, noting the subtle indentation where the writer had pressed harder at moments of emotional import. The hand tremor was barely perceptible but unmistakable to one trained to observe nuance. The letters spoke of money, of reputation, of entanglements both professional and personal. I read them slowly, aloud to myself in whispers that barely stirred the air, allowing the syntax, the pauses, and the occasional flourish to reveal character. In one brief note, the writer misquoted a line of poetry, altering its rhythm and, in doing so, its emphasis. Such carelessness or deliberate manipulation could indicate deceit, or perhaps the strain of suppressed feeling. I filed the observation away mentally, linking it to a similar misquotation noted at the masquerade. Patterns emerge quietly, and only patience reveals their significance. A librarian approached, her footsteps muted upon the stone floor. She carried herself with the measured confidence of one accustomed to both order and discretion, and her gaze lingered on my hands as they moved over the papers. She remarked upon the difficulty of organizing correspondence spanning decades, of tracing disputes that escalate subtly over time. Her voice was calm, yet the tilt of her head and the faint narrowing of her eyes hinted that she had observed more than she admitted. Gesture in such an environment is often as revealing as words. I paused at a set of envelopes tied with faded ribbon. One bore a faint smudge of ink and a postmark from a nearby town, overlooked in prior cataloguing. The address was correct, yet the date and the subtle curl of the paper suggested it had been sent, but intentionally delayed, held back to arrive at a moment of maximum effect. Small details. The curl of a letter, the weight of the envelope in the hand, often contain the essence of motive. I considered the sender, the recipient, and the implications of calculated timing. Lewis interrupted briefly to confirm the identities of several students mentioned in the letters. I allowed him to pursue procedural accuracy while I remained attentive to the minutiae. A crease in paper indicating a hurried folding, a faint scent of cologne that lingered unexpectedly, and the manner in which ink had bled slightly onto adjacent pages. These observations, subtle though they seemed, coalesced into a narrative not yet fully visible, but palpable in outline. As I concluded my examination, the quiet of the library settled around me once more. The letters, with their coded phrasing and careful omissions, seemed to breathe, carrying the weight of human concern and error. Oxford is generous in this way. The evidence exists in plain sight, yet its true meaning is only apprehended by those willing to attend to nuance, to gesture, to the whispered echoes that linger in corridors and margins alike. I left the library with a careful sense of the lattice of relationships, tensions, and secrets that had been catalogued in ink. Each letter, each misquoted line, each subtle mark on paper was a stepping stone toward comprehension, though the full significance had yet to emerge. In Oxford, truth is rarely abrupt. It arrives incrementally in fragments, demanding that one listens as attentively to the spaces between words as to the words themselves. I had returned to the college hall late that afternoon, the golden light from the high windows slanting across the dust motes in the air, giving the room a muted, almost reverential glow. The aftermath of the masquerade lingered in every corner. Crumpled ribbons, a single silk glove abandoned on the floor, and the faint scent of wine mixed with candle smoke. It was in this quiet, untidy aftermath that observation yielded its sharpest revelations. The photographs taken during the evening demanded renewed attention. One mask, of dark velvet with a subtle gold filigree, appeared in multiple frames, worn by different figures whose postures and gestures were distinct yet eerily similar. It was a minor repetition at first glance, but my memory of the night allowed me to detect a pattern. The person behind the mask had positioned themselves strategically, always within line of sight of the victim. Their movements were measured, almost choreographed. A small, deliberate gesture in one frame, a hand brushing the lapel, a tilt of the head, repeated across other. Images hinted at awareness of being observed, a silent communication that most would overlook. Lewis interrupted my study of the photographs with a brisk comment about students lingering in the quadrangle, but I was absorbed in detail. I noted a faint smudge of wax on the mask in one image, inconsistent with the surrounding decor. Wax smudges, though trivial to most, often betray proximity to candles, which in turn indicates presence at specific points in space and time. Such a subtle trace suggested the masked figure had moved deliberately through the candlelit hall rather than drifting randomly among guests. I recalled a remark from the young poet who had attended the masquerade. She had mentioned the mask slipping slightly as the wearer leaned to hear someone speak. That fleeting exposure, combined with the repetition in the photographs, allowed me to imagine the contours of the face beneath. Minor though it seemed, a careful observer might discern identity through posture, gesture, and habitual mannerisms, even without the features themselves. Later in the library, I reviewed letters that had surfaced earlier. One note, misfiled beneath a bundle of correspondence, referenced the masquerade in veiled terms, speaking of a presence both persistent and unnoticed. The handwriting bore a faint tremor at certain points, an almost imperceptible hesitation that betrayed the writer's awareness of observation. It aligned, I realized with a quiet thrill, with the sequence of gestures captured in the photographs. A brief encounter with the librarian reinforced the subtle deductions forming in my mind. She moved among the shelves with her customary discretion, yet her eyes flickered momentarily toward the photographs lying open on the table. The faint lift of an eyebrow, the tilt of her head, indicated recognition of significance she did not articulate. Gesture, in such moments, often communicates more than words, and I filed it alongside the wax smudge, the repeated posture, and the tremor in inked handwriting. I spent the late afternoon reconstructing the movement of the masked figure in my mind. Step by step, gesture by gesture, the choreography emerged from the shadows of memory and documentation. There was a deliberate intelligence to the positioning, a consciousness of observation, and a quiet manipulation of proximity. I did not yet have the full identity, but the mask itself, as both concealer and signifier, had revealed its secret. The individual's presence was intentional, their engagement with the victim precise, their awareness of scrutiny acute. As I left the hall, the light fading through the tall windows cast long, angular shadows across the floor. The mask, once a tool of concealment, now spoke through its repetition and gestures, offering a pathway to insight, though its wearer remained unexposed. I felt the familiar ache of anticipation, the quiet satisfaction of recognition that something, at last, was becoming discernible in the intricate lattice of Oxford's whispers and shadows. It was one of those evenings when the river fog drifts low over the colleges, curling around spires and gateposts, and the city takes on a hush that feels almost reverential. I walked slowly along the cobbled path beside the Isis, noting how the lamplight refracted on wet stones, each reflection a pale echo of the world above. In Oxford, past and present entwine with subtle insistence, and I had learned to attend to the echoes, for they often carry more than the immediate sense of events. My thoughts returned to the victim, to the masquerade, and to a document discovered that afternoon, previously overlooked in the library's archives. It was an old college poem penned decades earlier, coded in obscure rhyme and obscure enough to be dismissed as playful scholastic fancy. Yet something about its phrasing, the careful repetitions of words and the slight irregularities in meter, suggested a record of old grievances, a ledger of resentment cloaked in verse. I read it quietly, aloud in my mind, feeling the cadence and noting the irregular stresses, the subtle emphasis on names, the placement of adjectives, the deliberate inversion of syntax. The poem referenced events long past, rivalries that had been suppressed, debts of pride unpaid, and promises quietly broken. I noted a single recurring motif, a reference to a masked assembly, a phrase almost identical to the language used in the anonymous note. It was minor, a footnote to the casual reader, yet for those attuned to nuance, it resonated with ominous clarity. The past, it seemed, had been folded into the present with careful intent. In the quiet of the library, I revisited letters already catalogued. One, previously dismissed as innocuous, now appeared in a different light. The handwriting wavered at points. The ink smudged as though the writer's hand had faltered with emotion or urgency. The content referenced the victim's ancestors and a long-standing dispute regarding a college prize, a subtle inheritance of bitterness that had evidently persisted through generations. Timing, attention to detail, and the precise wording of threats embedded in pleasantries all pointed to a historical continuity of grievance. A minor detail caught my eye. A tiny annotation in the margin, almost imperceptible, marking a date coinciding with the victim's previous lecture at the masquerade hall. I had overlooked it before, distracted by more overt clues, yet it now seemed critical. The poet of the past had anticipated this very gathering, recording it with the precision of an archivist and the bitterness of one who had felt wronged. Human memory and manuscript ink, intertwined across decades, carried the weight of motive in ways that no living witness might reveal. The young poet I'd spoken with earlier appeared in the reading room, offering observations about the evening's events with careful neutrality. Her eyes lingered on the poem in my hand, and though she spoke nothing of its content, her silence conveyed recognition. Gesture, I reminded myself, is the quietest confession, and in that slight tilt of her head, the subtle lift of an eyebrow, she betrayed awareness of layers yet unspoken. I spent the remainder of the evening arranging mental maps of correspondence, photographs, and the coded poem, allowing the connections to coalesce. The masquerade, the anonymous note, and the historical grievances formed a lattice through which the evening's events could now be traced with increasing clarity. Oxford, with its ancient halls and lingering whispers, revealed itself in moments like this, when patience and attentiveness allowed past and present to converse in silence. As night fell and the fog thickened over the river, I understood that the key to the masquerade's enigma lay not only in present action, but in the weight of history, in subtle continuities of pride and grievance. The past had returned in the most understated manner, threading its influence through gestures, letters, and the faintest imprints upon photographs. And in Oxford, as I have always known, the past is never entirely past. It waits in quiet shadows for those willing to listen. The evening settled over Oxford with the familiar hush that follows rain, and I found myself once again in the dimly lit hall of Linton College. The remnants of the masquerade lay scattered in quiet disarray, yet my attention had long shifted from the broad strokes to the minutiae. The faint crease in a napkin, the subtle smudge of ink on a ledger, the barely perceptible tilt of a chair. These were the small things others dismiss, yet in them patterns begin to whisper their truth. I examined the photographs yet again, lingering on the repeated mask, its gold filigree catching the light differently in each frame. The angle of the wrist, the precise placement of fingers upon a balustrade, a shadow cast across a profile. Such gestures, when observed collectively, begin to delineate personality, intent, and, with careful inference, identity. One figure, previously obscured by costume, revealed an unconscious quirk in posture, a slight forward lean when speaking to the victim, repeated in 3 frames. The consistency of the movement suggested deliberation, a behavioral signature unnoticed by casual observers. A brief distraction occurred as Lewis approached, waving a small piece of paper. He noted a crossword clue from the morning's local newspaper, intended as a diversion from routine. Yet in my mind it flickered with latent meaning. 2 letters repeated in an unusual sequence, aligning with a sequence in the victim's letters. The repetition was subtle, almost playful, yet in combination with prior observations, it hinted at a cipher, a deliberate nod to someone attuned to detail. I made a mental note to revisit the correspondence, to trace the invisible lines between ink, gesture, and word. Among the library papers, a letter had slipped unnoticed beneath a stack of notes. Its edges were unevenly trimmed, and a faint indentation suggested hurried handling. The wording was casual, almost flippant, yet the placement of key words, emphasis slightly misaligned from grammatical expectation, suggested calculation. I sensed the writer's awareness of an audience, the intention to guide interpretation subtly, divert suspicion, or conceal motive. Such minor anomalies are often the gateways to comprehension, the hinges upon which understanding pivots. I observed the reactions of the few remaining students in the hall. One paused mid-step, catching sight of a particular ledger, then quickly averted her gaze. The gesture was imperceptible to anyone inattentive, yet to me it spoke volumes. Awareness, recognition, and a possible secret held with quiet vigilance. I catalogued it silently, filing alongside the misquoted line of poetry, the repeated gestures in photographs, and the crossword hint. Together, these fragments began to form a lattice of meaning. Returning to the photographs, I noticed a minor inconsistency in the sequence of the masked figures. The angle of the candlelight on the floor did not correspond with the supposed timing of events. It suggested a subtle manipulation of presence, the careful positioning of oneself within view while preserving the guise of innocuousness. The interplay of light and shadow, combined with the previously noted behaviors, provided a small yet undeniable thread connecting disparate observations into coherent trajectory. By the time I stepped onto the quadrangle, the fog had thickened, curling around lamp posts and forming dim halos that illuminated the wet cobbles. The footprints traced earlier were still discernible, leading toward the riverbank, then vanishing. Each minor detail, once catalogued and cross-referenced, had begun to reveal the broader narrative, a deliberate choreography, a concealment of intent, and a subtle orchestration of events culminating in the tragedy. What once appeared as disjointed evidence now whispered of motive, timing, and identity with quiet insistence. I paused to consider the convergence of observations, gestures repeated, misquoted lines, marginal annotations, and cryptic hints. Oxford teaches patience, the careful noting of shadows, the acknowledgement that understanding arrives incrementally. And here, in these small, unassuming details, the outlines of truth were emerging, ready to be traced with deliberate care toward revelation. The hall of Linton College was dimly lit when I returned that evening, shadows stretching long across the polished floor and candlelight catching on gilded frames of portraits, long silent. I had summoned the principal suspects under the pretext of reviewing evidence, yet the air was taut with anticipation, each figure poised with careful attention to decorum and the faintest flicker of unease. There is a peculiar tension in rooms where intellects gather, where each person is aware of the subtle cues offered by others, and I find it most revealing when silence is observed as rigorously as speech. I allowed the group to settle, eyes drifting toward the photographs, the letters, and the scattered annotations from the library. Then, carefully, I began to recount the movements as I had reconstructed them, the masked host's repetition in photographs, the misquoted lines, the faint wax smudge on the costume, the footprints fading toward the riverbank. Each detail was deliberate, catalogued, and presented with the quiet authority of observation rather than accusation. I noted how the young poet's fingers twitched as I mentioned the misquotation, and the librarian's eyes lingered a fraction too long upon the annotations, their silent reactions catalogued in the back of my mind. I drew attention to the sequence of gestures captured in the photographs. The tilt of a head, the extension of a hand, the positioning of a wine glass. Small, almost imperceptible movements that collectively revealed a choreography of presence and attention. It was here, in the repetition of gesture across images, that identity began to crystallize. I allowed the implication to settle before continuing, letting the quiet of the room press gently against each suspect. The anonymous note was laid on the table, folded with care. All is not as it seems at Linton College. Beware the masked host. I read it aloud, emphasizing the measured syntax and the deliberate phrasing. It was not mere warning, it was misdirection, a prompt for observation. I had seen, in the minor details, the hand that guided attention and the mind that calculated the effect of each movement. The rhythm of gesture, of hesitation, of controlled awareness spoke louder than any overt declaration. I traced the sequence of letters and documents from the library, connecting them to the historical grievances hidden in the coded poem, and noted how the interplay of past and present framed motive. A faint crease in an envelope, a subtle tremor in the ink, and the repetition of phrasing allowed the underlying narrative to emerge. The orchestration of attention, the concealment of identity, and the deliberate manipulation of perception. Each minor anomaly, once catalogued, led inexorably to the same conclusion. I watched as the realization began to settle upon the face of the true perpetrator. There was a pause, a barely perceptible tightening of the jaw, a flicker in the eyes, and then a quiet admission emerged, articulated not with flourish, but in calm, controlled voice. The motives were neither capricious nor gratuitous, pride wounded by decades-old grievances, fear of exposure, and the desire to manipulate circumstance to an end long desired. The confession unfolded as quietly as the evidence had been gathered, each word deliberate, reflective of intellect and emotional calculus intertwined. In the aftermath, the room remained still, the weight of observation and revelation pressing upon all present. The city outside was cloaked in darkness, fog drifting low across cobblestones and glimmering lamplight. The masquerade, once a scene of gaiety and concealment, had revealed itself as a stage upon which intellect and emotion had danced with meticulous care. I considered, briefly, the interplay of human ambition, past grievances, and the delicate precision of observation, understanding that in Oxford, truth often arrives quietly, measured, and inexorably. The fog had thickened over Oxford by the time I walked once more along the cobbled streets, the spires and towers barely discernible through the damp veil. Lanterns cast pale circles upon slick stone, and the distant toll of a church bell punctuated the silence. The city, always a repository of memory and whisper, seemed to hold its breath in the aftermath of revelation. Even now, With the masquerade's truth unveiled, the residue of the night lingered, subtle and persistent. I thought of the young poet, of the librarian, of the masked figure whose intent had been concealed in gesture and shadow. Each had played their part, consciously or otherwise, in a drama whose final act had unfolded quietly in the college hall. Yet Oxford has a way of preserving its mysteries. The candlelight, the dust motes in the air, the faint echo of footsteps across stone floors, all seemed to hum with unspoken stories. I traced the sequence of events in my mind, step by step, gesture by gesture, noting how minor details had conspired to reveal motive and identity. The riverbank was deserted, mist curling over the isis, and I paused to consider the path of footprints I had followed days earlier. They vanished at the wrought iron gate, yet in them lay the record of intent, of movement, of subtle negotiation between presence and concealment. I could see, in imagination, the careful choreography of the masked host, the precise timing, the deliberate positioning to observe without revealing, to manipulate perception without violence. These were acts of intellect, entwined with pride, and human frailty in equal measure. Inside the college, the hall still bore traces of the masquerade. Faint wax smudges, crumpled ribbons, a silk glove left atop a chair. Each item, minor though it seemed, was a marker of interaction, a breadcrumb along the path to understanding. I lingered there briefly, cataloguing gestures, recalling misquoted lines, connecting letters and photographs with the quiet rigor of memory. The interplay of observation and deduction had brought clarity, yet the residue of emotion, fear, pride, regret, remained palpable in the room's air. I thought, as I often do in such moments, of the subtlety of human behavior, the foot-tapping, the half-lifted eyebrow, the tremor in a hand that goes unnoticed by all but the most attentive. It is in these gestures, these minor eccentricities, that one perceives character, motive, and sometimes even guilt. The masquerade, while festive in appearance, had functioned as a stage upon which human nature performed with precision, each participant unaware of the quiet scrutiny that would later reveal the truth. A crow passed overhead, its caw sharp and singular against the fog, and I imagined it as a punctuation to the city's subtle narrative. There was a melancholy in that sound, a reminder that even resolved mysteries leave echoes. I considered the anonymous note, the coded poem, the minor misquotations, and the repeated gestures in photographs. Each had been a fragment, and together they had led to comprehension. Yet the air itself seemed to retain the memory of the masquerade, as though Oxford refuses to surrender entirely to clarity. Walking home, I allowed the city's hush to settle over me, the fog softening edges and smoothing the sharpness of revelation. In the quiet, I felt the ache of observation, the persistent awareness that even when truth is revealed, human pride, desire, and regret persist in delicate tension. Oxford, as always, offered both revelation and restraint, insight and the quiet reminder that some questions, however answered, continue to resonate in shadowed streets, in candlelit halls, and in the echo of footsteps long past.